So this was supposed to be a very short video talking about what it's like playing Final Fantasy II for the first time, but after I reviewed the first game, I got a little curious on how some other people review these older games in the franchise and how they kind of like weigh their opinions around it. And I did something a bit stupid. And I looked up other people's opinions on the internet. 11 tier lists of all the Final Fantasy games, and imagine my surprise when my favorite game, Final Fantasy 13, scored remarkably low on most of these. But then also, Final Fantasy 2 is the bottom of 7 of them. I think Final Fantasy 3 got 1, and Final Fantasy 11 got a nod as well. That was weird for me. And I'm also not going to be playing that as part of this series. I just don't feel like setting up my own server. Is what it is. Sue me. FF14 is already going to be taking me hundreds of hours, and I signed up for that. I'm not signing up for 2 MMOs, bro. I'm not doing it. But Final Fantasy 13 Lightning Returns also got 2 nods as the worst game, and honestly should have got all of them in my opinion. But all in all, it's pretty safe to say that Final Fantasy II is one of, if not the most hated game in the franchise. So instead, this review is going to mostly focus on whether or not I think that's a fair and accurate take on the game, and why. The short answer is no, I don't. And the long answer is, however long the rest of this video is. So with that being said, Final Fantasy II. I honestly had very little expectations going into this game, but I definitely did not expect what I got. Right off the bat, we're introduced to our party of 4, Firion, Maria, Guy, Leon. Their home city of Fynn is being taken over in a grueling and vicious act of war, leaving them without their families, their home, and only alive because they are rescued by a group of resistance fighters. Leon's missing though, so it's just Firion, Guy, and Maria now. They are then taken to a nearby town which is the home base of the resistance fighters, and when they attempt to join, they're refused based off of how young and inexperienced in war they are. What follows is a 10-hour story about proving one's worth, striking back against injustice, and sacrifice as the young heroes fight to strengthen their skills, plunder ancient magics, and recruit new members and subdue the Emperor. That is to say, there's actually a story this time, and a pretty decent one at that. It's the series' first attempt at actual characters, and while they can be a bit simple in their design and personalities, they fit a role that engages with the world around them, and makes the way a lot of these styles of RPGs give quest feel so much less static. Somehow I forgot to mention this in the script, but there's this interesting conversation system where like you'll take keywords that people say, you'll remember them, and then you actually like regurgitate them back at them. That's a weird word. You'll say them back to them, and then they'll be able to like you actually develop conversations with these characters in a way more involved way, definitely than 1 did, and several of the games past this. It's a way of pretending to have agency, but actually makes the player involved in the conversation in a way, and I really like it. But there's also something to be said for how real Firion feels after he begs to join the resistance after watching everyone he knows be murdered by the Empire. It's the difference between a hero being chosen to save the world and a young man fighting to save his home, or a young girl searching for her lost brother. I mentioned that sacrifice is a huge element of Final Fantasy II's story, and that was mostly a nod to the fact that the 4th slot in your party is never really filled for very long. Most of the time, it's because whatever companion you have traveling with you is willing to give their life for you and your cause. It evokes the sentiment that young people are our future, and we leave all of our hopes for change with them when we die. This is felt especially in the case of Rykard, the Dragoon we find like somewhere halfway through the game, who ends up leaving his wyvern and his lineage to his son, who is now the last living Dragoon. I also just love Dragoons in this franchise so far. They're so cool. Like, look at that armor, man. It's sick. But I do think this is a good story that manages to stand on its own 2 feet more than I expected it to. And I hope I've managed to get that across, because whenever I read some of the reviews of this game, people don't really mention it. And if they do, it's normally as it's a carbon copy of Star Wars Episode 4, which I'm like, sure, there is a rebellion, there is an empire, and yes, there's a giant ship that they have to like destroy by like blowing up the core or whatever. That absolutely is true. But that's like halfway through the game, and unless I missed the part where Palpatine just drives a fucking hurricane into the rebel base, that's where the similarities end to me. You'd have to stop playing the game halfway through to like just be like, this is a Star Wars ripoff. Like, they go to hell, dude. You missed that part? I don't get it. My best guess as to why this game's story gets kind of like shuffled to the side is because of its unfortunate release schedule in the West. I assume if you're watching this video, you probably already know, but for the sake of people who might not, is the first Final Fantasies that released as 1, 2, and 3 in the West or outside of Japan were actually the 1st, the 4th, and the 6th game in the franchise. They were released in the late 80s, early 90s, and Final Fantasy II, the real Final Fantasy II, didn't actually get released in the West until like 2004 or something like that. So I don't really blame people having been exposed to the stories of 4 and 6, which 6 is being like well known as a lot of people's favorite for having like, it really swings for the fences in 6 is from what I understand. I haven't played it fully. We'll be doing that in a couple of weeks. Feel free to check out the Twitch channel if you want to come watch. But when you've been exposed to the stories of 4 and 6, it definitely can be seen why 2 is seen as kind of like more of the same. But, and you won't hear me say this ever again in this franchise. It did do it first, and it just happened to be exposed to people after. In general, I really don't believe in games getting credit for doing something first, such as Final Fantasy 1's probably not going to be ranked very high the further into the series I go, mostly because while it is the origin of this franchise, it's just not a good game objectively compared to a lot of the more recent games, which is why I reviewed it in its own vacuum. But it's not really fair to the future games to do that, I think. But ultimately, I do think that Final Fantasy II's storytelling is a bit underrated. It does get a couple of nods of appreciation for introducing a bunch of staples, like it's the first place Cid appears, as well it's also where like chocobos come from, which is weird because I didn't see a single chocobo during my playthrough. I guess I'm playing wrong, but I didn't see a single chocobo. What? I had to do research to find that out. I just flew on the ships, man. No, where's the chocobos? I don't know. But ultimately, 2 is seen very negatively, and most of that's because the story, which I think is pretty good, is overshadowed by a very legitimate conversation and complaint over its combat and progression system. Final Fantasy II opts for a non-traditional way of improving your character by having stats increase the more you use that specific stat. Want to increase your HP? Take damage. Want to upgrade your fire spell? Cast fire more. It was intended to allow you to build your team kind of however you wanted. You don't have to worry about your white mage getting one shot by a boss if anyone on your team can cast cure. But from all the reading that I've done, the reason that this implementation wasn't received well is because it can cause a lot of really weird gameplay decisions. For example, you don't get anything from killing monsters other than gold. Instead, you get stats from taking damage, casting spells. So if you want to min-max your grinding sessions, what it might look like is hopping into a fight, killing all except for one of the monsters, then casting damage spells on your own team, then casting cure on them. Killing the monsters did nothing essentially, but every black magic spell you cast will get that spell closer to its next level, help increase the user's max MP, and might increase your whole team's HP. In other words, it's a bit ass backwards. You should not be grinding by beating up your own team, even though that's kind of what sparring is in a way. It does make sense a little bit, okay? But like it definitely doesn't make sense in like a gameplay perspective that fighting bad guys is somehow a bad thing, or at least it's not a good thing. You just don't get anything from it, man. I do think the most simple solution to this is making it so you can't attack your own team. I don't know why that's a thing. I don't remember if it was in 1, but I do know I've seen it both in 3 and 4. And in 4, it's actually relevant. Like, you actually want to do it sometimes, which is dumb. But I can't think of other reasons why it would be in the game before they decided to turn it into a mechanic, like 3 games prior. Personally, I also really can't attest to this because I played the Pixel Remaster, which has 4 times XP, or in this game, it's actually 4 times like stat progression. This made the need to grind extremely negligible as a result. If you just fight the monsters that you come across, you get stats like crazy. You don't need to grind almost at all. At this point, I would be a bit remiss if I didn't mention the Souls of Rebirth version of the game, because a lot of people actually recommend this as the definitive version to play. It has some additional content not released in any other version of the game, even including the Pixel Remaster. It's about 2 hours where you get to play as a lot of the characters that died in the main story as they go on their journey in the afterlife. And while that is a really cool concept, I don't think it's worth dealing with this annoying progression system for the whole game. I decided to watch it on YouTube, and if you skip the battles, it takes like 30 minutes to watch it all. So you save a little bit of time and a lot of frustration. But honestly, if you don't like the idea of watching a YouTube video, I still think playing the Pixel Remaster and foregoing the extra content is infinitely better than playing the Game Boy version with the bad system. You'll just enjoy yourself more. I also am acknowledging that the Pixel Remaster didn't fix the system that's broken in Final Fantasy II, but rather just let me skip it entirely. But I think it's also fair to realize that all the other games that are in the Pixel Remaster also extremely benefit from the exact same thing. I played 1 with 4 times XP, and then I played this with 4 times stat progression, but I've been playing 3 and 4 in the 3D remasters that were made for like the DS or the DS Lite or something. And with the normal XP gains in those games, I can tell you honestly, grinding in these games it can be pretty rough. I don't want to spoil their respective videos that will be coming out pretty soon, but one thing is Final Fantasy III took twice as long as I expected it to, and it doesn't have twice the content, or at least it didn't feel like it. So I 100% attribute this to XP and grinding. I think the extra time sink really did hurt my perception of 3 playing it recently, because while I do enjoy grind in a lot of games, like I play Grinding Gear Games' Path of Exile, grinding for grinding's sake can just be boring sometimes. And I don't think a lot of these early games have the interesting game mechanics to really make the grind feel good. And so they do insanely benefit from this XP gain. And while, yes, I think 2 benefits significantly more than the rest, I think all of them should get that credit. The one thing they didn't manage to improve or move past is Final Fantasy II's absolutely horrible dungeon design. While I was playing Final Fantasy II, I decided to start taking notes so it would jog my memory while I make these scripts. The only thing I wrote down for this section of the video was, fucking doors in this dungeon design are so beyond ass. Now, dungeons from a design perspective can be pretty hard to make and find a way to make unique. My favorite Final Fantasy, 13, has a very different take on dungeon design that a lot of people really like to clown on, being that there is no subtlety and it's almost impossible to get lost. But at least it looks cool when you're going wherever you're going. What it lacks in turning your brain on in any meaningful type of way, I think it makes up for in being beautiful to look at. Final Fantasy II's design is, put a bunch of doors that lead absolutely nowhere. And what are we going to do when you're approaching a new boss fight? 4 doors. It fucking sucks, man. It's so bad. Let's wrap this video up, okay? So I want to leave you again with my main takeaways after playing Final Fantasy II. The first one is, it's a pretty dark story. The force thought in your party being a revolving door of making friends just to watch them die. It kind of hits hard. The game doesn't sit too long with any of these characters to build up your connection with them, but you can see they were going for something more than just be the hero, save the world. The second one is that Final Fantasy kind of has a bit of an identity crisis, and I think it still exists to this day. After the success of Final Fantasy 1, 2 was like rushed into production, and clearly wanted to throw so many of its eggs into the basket of storytelling. Much like the DNA that can be seen in some of these earlier games, like the Chocobos, Cid, or even the Warriors of Light, and how they can be seen in like future games, I think the uncertainty of what exactly a Final Fantasy game is supposed to be also still persists. And it's present here from the very second game. In the first 3 games alone, you go from a standard EXP system to a use-based skill system to a job system in Final Fantasy 3. You also go from nameless heroes to a set cast to a nameless heroes, and then again to a set cast in Final Fantasy IV. It has this weird air of trying to innovate while also like trying to catch up to itself. I think about watching Yoshi P talk about Final Fantasy 16 and how he really wanted to bring Final Fantasy 16 back to being like a must-buy franchise, and that it was weird that they were trying to innovate an RPG game into like a FPS kind of like action thing in the attempt to chase its own success. I don't know quite how to explain it, but it just doesn't feel like people know what a Final Fantasy game is. Even Final Fantasy. Obviously, I'm only 2 games into the franchise this year, but it does make me want to ask questions like, when does Final Fantasy land on its feet and really get a sense of its own identity? If it even does, when does it lose that? And maybe Final Fantasy never does, and people really only get a sense of what Final Fantasy is based off of what they played when they were kids, or the first Final Fantasies they were ever exposed to. I know Final Fantasy 13 is one that has a huge impression on me, and Final Fantasy 14 in its storytelling. Nostalgia does do wonders on how people perceive a game. And then finally, the main question that I asked at the top of this video is Final Fantasy 2 the worst game in the franchise? Well, I would argue that Final Fantasy 3's job progression is just as frustrating, and we'll talk about that more in the next video. And I think that Final Fantasy 4's story is actually way less swinging for the hills and way less like ambitious. But those are more debatable. I think Final Fantasy 2's advanced storytelling and more investment into the idea of character progression and allowing you to pick your team, and the fact that it only came out a year after the first one, in its current state with the Pixel remaster, it is so much better than Final Fantasy 1. I don't know why Final Fantasy 1's not like closer to the bottom of this list. It's just nostalgia, bros, I think. I mean, I guess please give me your opinion down in the comments, but he drives a fucking tornado, man.